Welcome to the Nourished Child Podcast, a show about childhood nutrition, feeding kids, and dealing with the ups and downs of growing a healthy child. Here's your host, registered dietitian and childhood nutrition expert, Jill Castle.
This episode is sponsored by Healthy Eating Research. On their Instagram, @HealthyEatingResearch, you can find evidence-based healthy feeding tips for your kids ages 2 to 8, backed by experts. Check out their advice today. Do you ever feel perplexed by your child's behavior, baffled by his motivation, or her knee-jerk reactions? I felt that way with my first child until I found the book that changed my parenting, Raising Your Spirited Child by Dr. Mary Kurcinka. Dr. Mary Sheedy Kurcinka was recommended to me over 20 years ago, and today I am so pleased to share this amazing parenting expert with you. Hi, everyone. Welcome to The Nourished Child. I'm Jill Castle, your host, and my guest today is none other than Mary Sheedy Kurcinka, or Dr. Mary, we can call her. She's a best-selling author and internationally recognized lecturer and parent educator. She is licensed in parent education and early childhood. She is a teacher who has pioneered efforts to bring temperament, neurobiology, the importance of sleep, and emotion coaching into homes, schools, childcare centers, medical practices, social services, and businesses. She's written several books, Raising Your Spirited Child, Raising Your Spirited Baby, Raising Your Spirited Child Workbook, Kids, Parents, and Power Struggles, and Sleepless in America. Is your child misbehaving or missing sleep? Dr. Mary, welcome to the Nourished Child Podcast.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
I'm thrilled to have you here, and I'm thrilled that you reached out to me and we found each other, and I just am so thrilled to know you and know your work. I know that temperament is such a big factor in all kinds of behavior for children, but I like to look at it through the lens of eating and behavior around food. But before we dive into all of that, I would love for you to just, in your own words, talk to my audience about how you got into the field of parenting, and specifically, what is it about temperament that has drawn you in?
So I am one of those individuals that was lucky enough to read a book when I was 13 years old about a child psychologist. And I thought that is what I wanted to do. So I ended up getting a bachelor's in child development and early childhood education. Once I did that, I was like, I want to work with the entire family system. So I went back, got a master's degree in family social science. And then actually started working in the Minnesota Early Childhood Family Education Programs, which provides parent education for any parent with a child from birth to kindergarten through the public schools. And as I was teaching, I began to recognize that there were children in our groups that many of the strategies that people recommended simply didn't work. And like ignore them and it'll stop. And it's like, no, you ignore them and they'll scream for the next 2 hours. And then I had my first child, and it ended up that he was one of those that many of the recommended strategies simply didn't work. And so I started exploring why and came upon the concept of temperament. And temperament describes our natural first reaction to the world around us. And there's actually a biological genetic underpinning to that. But how it's ultimately expressed is very much influenced by how we respond to the children and how we work with them and their life experiences. So I developed a curriculum, started speaking, and then ultimately wrote Raising Your Spirited Child, and now have Raising Your Spirited Baby as well.
Yeah, I mean, I know Raising Your Spirited Child because I can't even remember who recommended it to me, but I had probably read 4 or 5 other parenting books before I came upon your book. And my first daughter was, she's spirited. She was one of those kids that people would say, oh, these character traits in her are going to be of great value when she's an adult. And meanwhile, I was like, that's great, but I'm pulling my hair out trying to figure out how to work with her, and instinctively knowing that, some of the old tendencies, and we can talk about that if we want, but old parenting tendencies with children who are a little bit more spirited don't necessarily work and can actually be harmful, probably in some situations. So I found you and literally read your book several times over. It helped me so much. I haven't looked at Raising Your Spirited Baby, but I'm curious about dialing it back even to the earlier years. And I would love for you to talk about how you got from child to baby, and what, obviously, over your career, you've probably noticed things that were happening even earlier than childhood. So talk about that a little bit.
Well, the interesting thing as I was working with the spirited children is parents would also often say to me, in utero, this baby kicked so hard, or they wrestled around so much that we called them booty or bear. Or when this child was born, he shrieked so loudly that the nurses at the hospital were like, good luck with this one. And so the temperament is apparent even in utero and at birth. And again, while there is a stable element to it, it's really influenced by how we respond to it. So what happens, because there's the low key temperament, and those babies are pretty mellow. You feed them, you burp them, you lay them down, and they sleep. And then there's the more spirited, intense babies that, first of all, they don't feed unless you take them to a quiet, probably, dim room. They cannot feed in the middle of chaos or a busy situation. Their first reaction to that solid food is, and it may be 20 times before they stop spitting it out and actually swallow it. And so it's really important to know with those children, their first reaction's not their final decision. So the bottom line is, I began to recognize that it really, understanding temperament really impacted that infant-parent relationship. But most parents went at least 4 to 9 months before seeking help and understanding of what made their child more. And so I needed to write Raising Your Spirited Baby. So it was for them from the get-go to help them understand your baby's normal, but more. And so some of that advice about, let them self-soothe, for example, isn't going to work, because once your baby's upset, now they're not eating and now they're not sleeping. So you actually have to respond really quickly to their cues in order to keep them calm enough to then be able to feed and to sleep.
Very interesting. I can see how that really can play out. And the challenge is teaching parents, which obviously is what you're very good at, is teaching parents how to recognize those cues quite quickly and take action on them. Would you, at this juncture, just walk through the different types of temperaments and give us some examples of what that might look like?
So one of the traits, and probably the most outstanding trait, is intensity. So we're talking a continuum from the low key to the spirited, and in between are the spunky. So they're in the middle. So the low key, and it's really important also to recognize there's not a good temperament nor a bad temperament. Each of them has their strengths and each of them has their challenges. So for example, the low key baby, their cues are subtle. They go with the flow. They're just pretty flexible. The challenge with that is that they're so low key, you can miss that they're hungry. Or I've even had parents tell me, they missed an ear infection until they went to the well baby check. And the doctor was like, he has an ear infection. And the baby's reactions were so low key, they missed it. And so you really have to train yourself to recognize those subtle cues from that low key baby. The flip side with your intense baby is when they cry, it's a shriek. And so, as I said earlier, the first thing is you want to begin again catching subtle cues, because if they get to crying, shrieking, arching, now they can't eat. And so we want to pick it up earlier. The flip side of that is because their reaction's so intense, we also can overfeed, that they're, that they shriek and it's like, well, they just ate an hour ago, but they must be hungry again. So it's also recognizing they're dysregulated and they need calming. But if it's only been 45 minutes, hour, 90 minutes since they ate, then let's try some other soothing, calming strategies first. And then, if needed, feed them. So you would never deny a feeding, but it's not the first thing you're jumping to.
And then the temperament in the middle, which probably encompasses most kids. Is that fair to say? Okay.
Yes. So, there it's kind of knowing where are that child's triggers, because sometimes they're kind of low key, but then, maybe it's noise that triggers that child. So they can eat well at home, but take them to a noisy, busy place, and suddenly they're not eating, and then they get over hungry, and then fall apart, and you get a meltdown. And I think also with the intensity, and this fits very much with your work of the 6 mini meals. And because we don't want blood sugar drops. And so, again, these kids are intense, they're energetic. And so those mini meals dispersed through the day, not only to nourish with food, but also to stop and kind of recenter and calm, help to keep them in that kind of green zone, as I describe it, of calm energy, where they can hear you and work with you. So moderating that intensity and taking steps to calm throughout the day, keep your child working with you and prevent those meltdowns.
It sounds like just the biological swings in blood sugar can trigger reactions in a more intensively temperamental child. I remember, looking back, one of the things I figured out with my older daughter was that, and this was again not when she was an infant, but more like her toddler ages, her toddler stage, was she needed a lot of preparation before we could change anything. Like she needed a long ramp before we could actually pull the plug and say, okay, now it's time, we're leaving. The meltdowns would happen, at the playground when it was time, like we'd be at the playground from 9 to 10. At 10 o'clock, it was like, okay, let's go now. And it was like, whoa, that was not like, she needed lots of reminders, lots of, and also choices worked really well with her. Is there something, something around temperament with children? Is that something that can really help them, preparing them, anticipatory guidance, or?
Absolutely. And you're really describing there two more of the temperament traits. So the first one is adaptability. How quickly do we shift from one situation to another, or stop, start, or, going from one room to another, upstairs, downstairs. And some children are very adaptable. You can say, hey guys, stop play outside, come in, sit down for a meal. And they're fine. They can do it. But if you have a more slow to adapt child, if that if you're trying to transition them from I'm actively playing outside to now sit down and eat, it's like climbing a mountain. It's too big. And so we actually have to kind of plan a transition ritual that helps them kind of notch down and come calmly to the table. So one of the things that I always talk about, because I do private consultations with families, is creating a morning ritual, for example. So the kids wake, and instead of starting to play or getting on electronics, that they wake, they get dressed, they toilet, they brush hair, they brush teeth. All of those tasks are completed before they leave the sleeping area. So there's no upstairs, downstairs, in a room, out of a room. We eliminate unnecessary transitions. Plus, it's consistent. Every morning we wake and we dress. So when you ask them to get dressed, it's not a surprise, because surprises trigger slow to adapt children. So then again, rather than transitioning them from play when they're dressed, we bring them to the kitchen and begin involving them in the meal prep. And, there's a really fun study out of Mexico recently that shows if you allow your toddlers and preschoolers to participate in that meal prep, that not only does it develop a work ethic, which actually children are happier when they have that sense of I can do, but by the time they're 9, 10, they're making breakfast for the family. So it's a really important training time. So, and then with that is also, again, creating a predictable menu. So maybe every Monday, Wednesday, Friday, we eat the same breakfast foods. So if Monday, I know we're having yogurt parfaits or whatever it is your family is eating. But the bottom line is we're not starting. We're not shifting rooms. So we go right from helping to prepare that meal to sitting down together to enjoying that meal. And so it becomes a very calm point of connection before we separate for the day. So that's the adaptability, is that we are very conscious about moving to the table in a state of calm energy.
It sounds, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, in that second trait of choices is there's differences in persistence. And some children are like, from the get-go, they are, I do it myself. And they want some choices and they need some choices. The other is the child who's not as tenacious. And so they're very flexible, but they'll also let you continue to feed them or to help them long after they're capable of doing it themselves if you don't gently nudge them to become more independent.
So the word persistence just really strikes me, because that is, a strong character trait that I experienced with my own child. And, like a dog with a bone, never going to let go a particular idea or desire that they want. And so what I'm hearing you say is that predictability, and I talk a lot about predictability with mealtimes and snacks, and that structure that we can set up for kids, because kids just do really well with predictability, but even more so for the child who has a more intense temperament. That sounds like it's very key in helping them get that calm energy, as you said. And then persistence. Let's dive into that a little bit, because I think what I was hearing you say is that some children are more persistent and others are really kind of lackadaisical. They'll let you take charge and do whatever. And I do see this with some of my clients, particularly in the infancy and early toddlerhood stage, where the child is happy to have mom and dad feed them with a spoon. Long, well beyond the point where they should be self-feeding, which we know is around 7, 8 months, they should start to do the self-feeding thing. So that is really interesting to tie that to temperament, because I think the knee-jerk reaction or the thought process is to blame the parent for ongoing feeding of the child with a spoon, but it actually could be the temperament of the child that is really making that sort of the reality for that family.
It's very much a two-way street in regard to temperament. And, and that's also in my book, Raising Your Spirited Child, not only do we have the charts to go through to identify your child's temperament, but we also have one for the parents. Because, for example, if you're very persistent and you have a persistent child, which is likely to occur because there is that genetic element, then you want it done your way and your child wants it their way. And so that's where very early on we start teaching problem solving skills of we're a problem solving family. How do we work together? And so that child we start involving in meal planning. And while the parent remains responsible for what foods are in the house and which ones are served, and yet at the same time, we're getting input from that child. And again, often that child actually starts cooking and preparing some of those meals much younger than people might think a child is capable of doing it. And of course, we supervise them, but you want to guide them, and at the same time, just let them go, but you're setting up kind of the fences to keep them on the right path. And then that slow, the less persistent child, and they may also have a low frustration tolerance. So they try the spoon and it's like, oh, it's too hard, or, I can't use the fork. It's too hard. And so they kind of train us not to give it to them again. And so that's, again, to recognize that, okay, he's got a low frustration tolerance. So first of all, let's start practice before he's too hungry. So we're not starving and trying to do this. And we might do some, just role playing and imaginative play at non-meal times using those utensils to help them become more comfortable. But we also always start out the meal with nudging them by, okay, let's give you the spoon, let's give you the fork, and letting them give it a shot before we just don't even try to give them the opportunity.
As a parent, I know how difficult it is to get your kids to eat anything, much less eat a healthy meal. There's a group called Healthy Eating Research that has you covered. Their latest tips for how to feed kids include dozens that make mealtime less of a battle. Use expert-recommended and backed by science tips to transform meals into a time for kids to explore new foods, even when they don't realize it. Learn more and find your favorite tip you can try today by visiting @HealthyEatingResearch on Instagram. I have seen parents get hung up with that. Like, my child won't do it themselves. They just will sit there and they will not eat. And so I love how you've tied temperament to that, because it sort of is beneficial for the parent to understand that they don't feel the guilt of I've caused this, that it actually is an inherent characteristic of the child, and there's a workaround. So when we think about I can see the benefits for parents understanding their child's temperament, but can you talk us through what some of those benefits for parents are in particular?
Well, it's huge because temperament helps us understand why. Why is my child responding the way that they are? And to solve a problem, we have to be able to identify what's the feeling and need behind this behavior, what's fueling it. So temperament helps us to understand, okay, my child is not eating in this situation because it's too noisy. Another trait so sensitivity is a trait. And you know these kids because these are the kids who know the differences in brands. It's like, no, you're not sneaking in that one for me. But also it helps. It just helps you understand what's happening. So another trait is how perceptive children are. And so if meals are stressful, and that's where your work comes in of how do we make meals a peaceful point of connection, mm-hmm. Because for highly sensitive, perceptive, intense kids, if we sit down and we're stressed and we're thinking this kid has got to eat, and especially if there's been a medical issue and so we're worried about their weight or their growth, and so there's pressure. And as soon as that child perceives that conflict, that stress, their brain literally says, hey, we're under threat here. Don't eat because we need the blood in the muscles in case we need to fight or flee. And so now it's not that he won't eat, he can't mm-hmm. eat. And so again, that's where the division of responsibilities becomes so important of once you've served that food family style, you've included something you know the children like, is now your job is finished. There's no fighting over the food. And that is so critical for these highly sensitive, perceptive kids to be able to relax and eat.
That's such a great point. And you're making me also think about, you mentioned medical concerns, and I'm thinking of, how does this all play into things like ADHD and autism, for example? Because there are, I imagine, natural temperament tendencies in those conditions, but then there's also the underpinnings of the condition that are influencing the child as well. What would you have to say about that?
So in my book, Kids, Parents, and Power Struggles, I speak to that directly, that every individual has a temperament. That's part of who we are. And then on top of that, we also have development influencing how it's played out. We have stress levels influencing how it's played out. And sometimes we also have medical conditions. And so when you're working with temperament, when you understand it and you work with it, and yet your child is still struggling, then it's like, okay, we need to dig deeper. Is there a medical factor coming into play here? And it just, again, it helps us to say, okay, this should be working because we're working with his temperament, but it's better, but we're still not there. And so then we dig deeper. I also wanted to jump back, if you don't mind, to when you were talking about the regular meals that you recommend. There's another aspect to that is critical, because one of the temperament traits is regularity. And some children, by their very nature, are very regular. You can predict he needs breakfast, mid-morning snack, his lunch. You could set a clock by his body. But then you have the irregular kids, and they just they might eat breakfast, they might not. They might be hungry for the mid-morning snack, maybe not. Maybe they don't eat lunch. Their biggest meal of the day is mid-afternoon snack. And so, again, we're kind of like, oh, he's really flexible, except regular meals set the body clock. So if we have this free run of when we're eating and when we have meals, it actually impacts the body clock. And the brain now doesn't know, well, when are we supposed to be awake and eating? And when are we supposed to be asleep? And so not only are you nourishing your child with the regular meals, but especially for that child whose body clock can free run easily, is you're setting it so now bedtime is peaceful because the brain is on your side saying, okay, we've had our meals, we had our day, and now it's time for sleep.
Yeah, that's good. That's good stuff. What is the most surprising thing in your career that you've learned about temperament and children?
Oh, that's a great question. I think the most fun for me has been because another part of my work and part of the term spirited child, which I coined, is that each of these temperament types has their strengths. And it's, helping that family see that where they thought, okay, this child is stubborn or lazy and I help them use temperament to reframe that of, oh, he's persistent, he's tenacious, committed to his goals. Do you know that's a number one predictor of success? Now, and suddenly we've changed our relationship because we're seeing that child not as a jerk, but as an individual who does have tenacity. Now, that doesn't mean we just say, oh, he's tenacious and he gets to do whatever he wants. It means he's tenacious. This is an essential life skill and critical to resiliency now, during the pandemic and this difficult time. So we need to make sure we teach him problem solving skills. So he learns to be a flexible thinker and works with us. But I think that to me, because people have come back and said, this was the first time anyone said something positive or helped me see the strengths of my child. And that's what I've loved doing.
And you've done that so well because I can tell you that's how I felt after I read your book. It was just a complete reframing of how I thought about my child and putting her strengths in a positive light as opposed to pesky behavior or annoying child or things like that parents can feel, but then when they start to say those things, they just, that can be damaging to the child itself and certainly damaging to the relationship. So persistence, can we explore some of the reframing for, you said persistence was tenacious, some of the other irregular, how might you reframe that terminology and put it as a strength?
So if we go back to the intensity, sometimes people will again, just she is shrieking or, she's this walking volcano. And so, I never contradict someone, but I'll say to them, oh, so she's passionate and oh my gosh, she is just so zestful. And her emotions are incredibly sensitive and aware. And so again, we're reframing that, or instead of he's hyper and, he never stops and is, oh, wow, look at the energy and the athleticism of that child and so coordinated. And oh my gosh, look at what he can accomplish and do. And so again, we're going to make sure he's had swimming lessons, climbing lessons to keep him safe, because he is going to be climbing and leaping into the pool. But we see this as the asset it truly is.
I love that. I love that so much. And I hope parents out there listening can start to think about their own children and the strengths that the temperament brings to the family. If we, I wanted to ask you sort of as our wrap up question, some, to ask you to give the audience some sort of universal temperament tips for parents when they're raising their children. Understanding their temperament is probably one of your tips, I would imagine. And I know that your books, your website, parentchildhelp.com, all of your books, which are, I think, available on your website, but also for sure on Amazon and in bookstores. But what tips, walk away tips would you give for parents at this juncture if they wanted to learn more about temperament, wanted to start to reframe the way they think about their child, and even just start to really just get to the fundamental basics of understanding what their child's temperament is?
So I think a couple of things in both raising your spirited baby and raising your spirited child. What I talk about is trusting your child, that you allow them to show you what they need and kind of quiet those other voices that say, well, he shouldn't be active or she shouldn't be so sensitive. Is to recognize she is sensitive. So how do we help her manage the situation? And I think that's an important point that also comes through in my books. And I describe what I call the gentle nudge. So we don't avoid situations because my child is more sensitive or intense, but we break the skills necessary to manage high stimulating situations or to manage that intensity into small steps that never overwhelm the child so that they develop the skills to cope and to manage it well. So, as adults, in fact, my daughter has always, she's afraid to fly. And yet my daughter is a diamond. My daughter's an adult and she has like the 100,000 miles of flight. And I asked her once, do you still fear flying? And she said, yes, but I know how to manage it. And that's what we're doing with our spirited kids and just in using temperament in general is helping them understand why do they respond the way they do and what skills help them to be successful in those situations. And then this last thing I want to put in there, and that's in Sleepless in America, is that how critical sleep is. So for example, again, if dinner is chaos at your house, it may be simply that you're actually serving it too late. And those more intense and sensitive spirited kids are going to be the most vulnerable. But if your child cannot stay in their chair and they're up and down and not eating at dinner, move it 15, 30 minutes earlier and then get them to bed that much earlier. And that meal will change.
Yeah, that's great advice. Do you find that a lot of kids are missing out on sleep and that's affecting just their daily functioning? I assume.
It is an epidemic in the States right now. Yes. And I do. In fact, in my consultations, families will come to me because of challenging behaviors. And the first thing we have to fix is how much sleep they're getting, because quite honestly, 99% of the kids who are experiencing meltdowns, power struggles, huge sibling issues, they're short on sleep. And until you get enough sleep, you can't teach problem solving skills. You can't, they have no frustration tolerance. They can't remember rules. They can't settle and eat. And so when we get them the sleep that they need, what happens is the intensity, the frequency, the duration of those meltdowns disappear. And now instead of working with 20 meltdowns a day, we got 2. And now we can do the emotion coaching, the problem solving, the working with them to teach the skills and help them be successful.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Mary, I so appreciate you coming on the show and sharing your expertise in this area. Where can listeners find you and connect with you?
Well, you can find, as you said, all of my books, Raising Your Spirited Baby and Spirited Child. All of those are on Amazon and the other books, Barnes Noble. They're all available. You can also go to my website, childhelp.com. And there you can enter your email for my weekly blog. And also there's a link to join the Spirited Child and Baby Facebook group.
Wonderful. And I have that link. I'll include all of those links in the show notes so people can find those. Thank you so much for coming on the show. It's a delight. I have admired your work for 25 years. My daughter just turned 25, and I feel like you've been in my life and influencing my own career and my own way of doing things. And I really appreciate your work.
Well, thank you. And it's mutual. I love yours too. And I'm telling parents about your books and your programs as well, because they're great. They're just such a great match of understanding temperament and nutrition and just the pleasure of peaceful meals.
Yeah. Well, thanks again.
Thanks for listening to the Nourished Child Podcast, where the #1 goal is to help you grow a nourished child inside and out.